Now, 3 months on from the Salisbury attack, relations between Britain and Russia are at their lowest ebb since the Cold War. From Syria to Ukraine, the Kremlin is pursuing policies that put it at odds with the West. It's a diplomatic conflict that took a bizarre turn this week when a Putin critic allegedly murdered by a Kremlin-backed assassin came back from the dead to appear at a press conference in Kiev. Joining me now is Samuel Greene, Director of the Russia Institute at King's College London, and International Affairs Analyst Marko Gasic. Very nice to have you both here. So, do you fear that some of the attacks on Russia now have gone a bit too far? Is there kind of a Russophobia, or are we just getting to grips with what is effectively a slightly warmer version of the Cold War?
Well, so I'm not happy with the term Russophobia. I think that it suggests that the problem that we have, that we're dealing with, is somehow medical and it needs to be solved in a psychiatrist's office. And I think that the reality is that Western publics, Western governments, the media to a certain extent, have begun to respond to what has been a pattern of news, of behavior, of action and denials coming from official Moscow, coming from the Kremlin, over a number of years, right? Really going back to initial denials about the providence of little green men in Crimea and the object of Russian strategy there, stretching into eastern Ukraine, stretching into the downing of MH17, stretching into Salisbury earlier this year.
So if anything, you would argue that the West has been a bit soft on?
No, I'm not arguing that at all. What I'm arguing is that there is increasingly little patience, right, for denials when so many of those denials have turned out to be not quite true. And as a result, I think Russia, frankly, again, official Russia, has painted itself into a bit of a corner, right? Now, even in a case that is eminently murky, like the Babchenko case, there is, again, very little patience, very little willingness among publics that might, in earlier times, have been willing to be skeptical. There's very little willingness to hear out the Russian side of the story.
Marko Gasic, I mean, there was an opportunity, wasn't there, where Russia was invited into the kind of full member of the international community, the West. Even there was a moment where they were going to join the European Union 10 or 15 years ago, I remember. But that's all gone now. And is this not the Kremlin's fault?
No, I don't think so. I think, talking of patterns of news, there's been a pattern here that's been fairly systematic over the period that Samuel describes, which is a pattern of accuse Russia, don't allow Russia from joining in the investigation, bring your chums in to agree with you, launch the fake news as stridently, and after the fake news, have a fake investigation where you come to the same conclusion that you had at the beginning.
Now, the original fake news, I remember watching the pictures of the Russian soldiers in Crimea and the Russian government denying that they were Russian, and yet we now know that they definitively were, because people have gone and found their relatives. So we've had Crimea, I mean, the list is MH17, we had all these things. You know the list. Is there any surprise that the West is acting aggressively to protect its interests?
Well, the West, I think it's cart before horse here. The West acted first and the Russians reacted. In the case of Crimea, you have, in effect, Crimea seceded from an illegal government in Kiev, running an extreme nationalist campaign at the expense of the Russians in Crimea, in a country without a functioning constitution. Whereas, in contrast, for example, in the case of Kosovo, earlier you had a legal government in 2008 seceded from by Kosovo in a country with a inclusive multi-ethnic campaign and a functioning constitution. So really, we have to ask who starts these things. And I think that the Russians really have a case which is simply not being allowed to be heard.
Sound great?
Russia was invited into discussions, was made aware, for example, of the discussions around the DCFTA and the association agreement with Ukraine, as well as Moldova, Armenia. Right, exactly. Yeah. And decided for, in fact, several years running, because these negotiations take a long time, the EU being the EU, decided to ignore them until such a time as they decided that now they saw the EU in a different light as a geopolitical threat. I think, unfortunately, we hear rather ahistorical interpretations of events in Crimea. There are changes of power in countries all over the world. The idea of the lack of constitutional authority in Ukraine in early 2014, frankly, is is ludicrous, certainly no more than the lack of authority in southern Russia.
A country was a legitimate elected ruler was overthrown in a coup by a mob, presided over by EU leaders handing out cookies to the mob, and that's completely unconstitutionally. That's what actually happened.
Out of negotiations on the 21st of February of 2014.
Once the mob were at his throat,
in Kiev, and was escorted by a Russian official out of the country to
He's
Russian
another man
territory.
in Ukraine who feared for the safety of his life, but he feared from the safety of a mob that had been inspired by a renter mob. As Victoria Nuland said, we spent $5 billion changing regime in Ukraine.
Marko Gasic, Sam Greene, we're not going to get you guys to agree, but thank you for coming in and debating that. This is All Out.